Chapter 6 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 6. In Darkness and in Light. When the men had disappeared into the house, Archie remained under his stairhead, considering. He had been told in his instructions to discover two things: whether Logie was in touch with Ferrier, and whether the Happy Land was frequented by the pair. Though Ferrier was in command of the small Jacobite force in Brecon, it was suspected that he spent an unknown quantity of his time in Montrose. To the first three of these questions he had already mastered the answer. It only remained for him to be absolutely certain that the house in front of him was the Happy Land. He could not swear that he was in the New Wynd, though he was morally certain of it, but there were marks upon the house which would be proof of its identity. There would be a little hole covered by an inside sliding panel in the door of the Happy Land, through which its inmates could see anyone who ascended the stair without being seen themselves, and there would be the remains of an ancient risp or turling pin at one side of it. Archie ran lightly across the street, crept up the staircase, and passed his palm over the wood. Yes, there was the hole, 2 inches deep in the solid door. He put in his finger and felt the panel in the farther side. Then he searched along the wall till his hand came in contact with the jagged edge of the ancient risp. There was no ring on it, for it had long been disused, but it hung there still, a useless and maimed veteran put out of action. He returned to his post satisfied. His discoveries had earned him the right to go home, but he did not mean to do so. How he was going to get back into Balnillo House unseen he did not know, and had not, so far, troubled himself to imagine. Perhaps he might have to stop out all night. He hoped not, but he was not going to meet trouble halfway. The house would be locked, the household, with the exception of the errant James, abed, and his own room was not upon the ground floor. However, these were matters for later consideration, and he would remain where he was for a time. For all he knew, Ferrier and Logie might combine business with pleasure by staying in the Happy Land till morning, but they were just as likely to come out within measurable time, and then he could see where they went. He was quite happy, as he was everywhere. He fell to thinking of other things, of his host with his thin, neat legs and velvet coat, of that riding the circuit upon which the old man valued himself so much. In his mind's eye he figured him astride of his floundering nag at the edge of some uninviting bog in an access of precise dismay. That was how he would have wished to paint him. His powers of detachment were such that he became fascinated by the idea, and awoke from it with a start to hear the footsteps of Logie and Ferrier coming down the stairway opposite. They did not retrace their way up the Wynd, but went on to its end and turned into a street leading southwards, whilst Archie slipped along in their wake. At last they reached a wilderness of sheds and lumber, above which stood a windmill on a little eminence, and the strong smell of sea and tar proclaimed the region of the harbour. A light shone clear and large across the dark space of water, touching the moving ripples, and this Archie guessed to be the riding light of the Venture, which lay like a sullen watchdog under Ferryden village. He had to go very warily, for the pair in front stopped often and stood talking in low voices, but the bales and coils of rope and heaps of timber with which the quays were strewn gave him cover. He could not get close enough to them to hear what they said, but their figures were much plainer against the background of water than they had been in the streets, and he noted how often Logie would stretch out his arm, pointing to the solitary light across the strait. There was scarcely any illumination on this side of it, and the unrigged shipping lay in darkness as Ferrier and his friend went along the quay and seated themselves on a windlass. Archie, drawing closer, could hear the rustle as the former unrolled James's map. The soldier took out his flint and steel and struck a light, covering it with his hand, and both men bent their heads over the paper. Archie's wrist smarted afresh as he saw it. His sleeve had rubbed the burn, and he could feel the oozing blood. He crouched behind them, peering through the medley of ropes and tackle which hung on the windlass. By standing up, he could have touched the two men. He had no idea what it was that they were studying, but his sharp wits told him that it must be a map of some kind, something which might concern the English ship across the waterway. He longed to get it. His confidence in his own luck was one of the qualities that had served him best, and his confidence in his own speed was great and, moreover, well placed. He knew that he had 12 years of advantage over James, and from the sound of Ferrier's voice he judged that he had the same, or more, over him. The temptation of chance overmastered him. He raised himself noiselessly, leaned over the intervening tackle, and made a bold snatch at the map, which Ferrier held whilst James was occupied with the lighted twist of tow. But his luck was to fail him this time. Logie moved his hand, knocking it against Flemington's, and the light caught the paper's edge. A soft puff of sea wind was coming in from over the strait, and in one moment the sheet was ablaze. Archie snatched back his hand and fled, but the glare of the burning paper had been bright enough to show Logie a man's wrist, on which there was a fresh bleeding mark. The bright flare of the paper only intensified the darkness for the two astounded men, and though each was instantly on his feet and running in the direction of the retreating footsteps, Archie had threaded the maze of amphibious obstacles and was plunging between the sheds into the street before either of them could get clear of the pitfalls of the quay. He tore on, not knowing whither he went. His start had been a good one, but as he paused to listen, which he did when he had gone some way, he could hear them following. The town was so quiet that he met nobody, and he pressed on, trusting to luck for his direction. Through the empty streets he went at the top of his speed, launched on the flood of chance, and steering as best he could for the north end of the town. Finally, an unexpected turning brought him within a few yards of the north port. He waited close to the spot where he had first taken shelter and listened. Then, hearing nothing, he struck out at a brisk walk for the country and was soon clear of Montrose. He sat down by the wayside to rest. He had had a more sensational night than he expected, and though his spirits were still good, his ill luck in missing the paper he had risked so much to obtain had cooled them a little, and by the light of this disappointment he looked rather ruefully on his poor prospects of getting to bed. It was past midnight, and there seemed nothing to do but to return to Balnillo and to make himself as comfortable as he could in one of the many outbuildings which the yard by its back door contained. The household rose early, and at the unlocking of that door he must manage to slip in and gain his bedroom. He rose, plodded home, and stole into the courtyard, where, searching in an outhouse, he found an endurable couch on a heap of straw. On this he spread his coat like a blanket, crawling under it, and with a calmness born of perfect health and perfect nerves, was soon asleep. When dawn broke, it found him wakeful. He had not rested well, for his burnt wrist was very sore, and the straw seemed to find it out and to prick the wound no matter how he might dispose his hand. He propped himself against the wall by the open outhouse window, whence he could see the back door of Balnillo and watch for the moment of its first opening. It would be neck or nothing then, for he must enter boldly, trusting to hit on a lucky moment. At last the growing light began to define details of the house, tracing them out on its great mass with an invisible pencil, and he thought he heard a movement within. The stable clock struck 6, and high above he could see the sun touching the slates and the stone angles of the chimney stacks with the first fresh ethereal beam of a pure October morning. He inhaled its breath lovingly, and with it there fell from him the heaviness of his uneasy night. All was well, he told himself. His sensuous joy in the world, his love of life and its hazards and energies came back upon him, strong, clean, and ecstatic, and the sounds of a bolt withdrawn made him rise to his feet. A maidservant came out carrying a lantern whose beam burned with feeble pretentiousness in the coming sunlight. She set it down by the threshold and went past his retreat to the stable. No doubt she was going to call the men. When she had gone by, he slipped out and in a dozen paces was inside the house. Another minute and he was in his room. He looked with some amusement at the rough effigy of himself which he had made in the bed overnight, and when he had flung the cushion back to its place, he got out of his clothes and lay down, sinking into the cool luxury of the sheets with a sigh of pleasure. But he had no desire to sleep, and when a servant came to wake him half an hour later, he was ready to get up. He rose, dressed, wrote out the detailed description of his night's discoveries, and put the document in his pocket to await its chance of transmission. A message was brought to him from Lord Balnillo as he left his room, which begged his guest to excuse his company at breakfast. He had been long astir and busy with his correspondence. At 11 o'clock he would be ready for his sitting, if that were agreeable to Mr. Flemington. As Mr. Flemington realized how easily he might have met the judge as he ran through the shuttered passage, his belief in the luck that had used him so scurvily last night returned. There was no sign of James as Archie sat down to his meal, though a second place was set at the table, and as he did not want to ask embarrassing questions, he made no inquiry about him. Besides which, being immoderately hungry, he was too well occupied to trouble about anyone. He went out upon the terrace when he had finished. The warm greyness of the autumn morning was lifting from the earth, and it was still early enough for long shadows to lie cool on the westward side of the timber. As they shortened, the crystal of the dew was catching shafts from the sun, and the park seemed to lie waiting till the energy of the young day should let loose the forces of life from under the mystery of its spangled veil. Where the gean trees glowed carmine and orange, touches of quickening fire shot through the interstices of their branches, and coloured like a tress of trailing forget-me-not. The South Esk wound into the basin of Montrose, where the tide, ebbing beyond the town, was leaving its wet sands as a feasting ground for all sorts of roving birds, whose crying voices came faintly to Archie, mellowed by distance. Truly this was a fascinating place, with its changing element of distant water, its great plain lines of pasture, its ordered vistas of foliage. The passion for beauty lay deep below the tossing, driving impulses of Flemington's nature, and it rose up now as he stood on the yew-edged terraces of Balnillo and gazed before him. For the moment everything in his mind was swallowed up but the abstract fundamental desire for perfection, which is, when all is said and done, humanity's mainspring, its incessant though often erring guide, whose perverted behests we call sin, whose legitimate ones we call virtue, whose very existence is a guarantee of immortality. The world this crystalline morning was so beautiful to Archie that he ached with the uncomprehended longing to identify himself with perfection, to cast his body down upon the light-pervaded earth and to be one with it, to fling his soul into the heights and depths of the limitless, encompassing ether, to be drawn into the heart of God's material manifestation on earth, the sun. He understood nothing of what he felt, neither the discomfort of his imprisonment of flesh, nor the rapturous, tentative wing sweeps of the spirit within it. He left the garden terrace and went off towards the Basin, with the touch of that elemental flood of truth into which he had been plunged, for a moment, fresh on his soul. The whole universe and its contents seemed to him good, and not only good, but of consummate interest. Humanity was fascinating. His failure to snatch the map from Ferrier's hand last night only made him smile. In the perfection of this transcendent creation all was, and must be, well. His thoughts, woven of the same radiant appreciation, flew to James, whose personality appealed to him so strongly. The gentle blood which ran in the veins of the pair of brothers ran closer to the surface in the younger one, and a steadfast, ostentatious gallantry of heart seemed to be the atmosphere in which he breathed. He was one of those whose presence in a room would always be the strongest force in it, whether he spoke or was silent, and his voice had the tone of something sounding over great and hidden depths. It was not necessary to talk to him to know that he had lived a life of vicissitude, and Archie, all unsuspected in the watches of last night, had seen a side of him which did not show at Balnillo. His grim resourcefulness in small things was illustrated by the raw spot on the young man's wrist. That episode pleased Flemington's imagination, though it might have pleased him even better had the victim been someone else. But he bore James no malice for it, and the picture of the man haunting the dark quays, strewn with romantic sea-going lumber, and scheming for the cause at his heart, whilst the light from the hostile ship trailed the water beside him, charmed his active fancy. But it was not only his fancy that was at work. He knew that the compelling atmosphere of Logie had not been created by mere fancy, because there was something larger than himself, and larger than anything he could understand, about the soldier. And feeling, as he was apt to do, every little change in the mental climate surrounding him, he had guessed that Logie liked him. The thought added to the exultation produced in him by the glory of the pure morning, and he suddenly fell from his height as he remembered afresh that he was here to cheat him. It was with a shock that he heard Skirling Wattie's pipes as he reached the Montrose road and saw the beggar's outlandish cart approaching, evidently on its return journey to Montrose. His heart beat against the report that lay in his pocket, awaiting the opportunity that fate was bringing nearer every moment. There was nobody to be seen as the beggar drew up beside him. The insolent joviality that pervaded the man, his almost indecent oddness, things which had pleased Archie yesterday, struck cold on him now. He had no wish to stay talking to him, and he gave him the paper without a word more than the injunction to have it dispatched. He left him, hurrying across the Montrose road and making for the place where the ground began to fall away to the Basin. He sat down on the scrubby wasteland by a broom bush whose dry burst pods hung like tattered small flags in the brush of green. Their acrid smell was coming out as the sun mounted higher. Below him the marshy ground ran out to meet the water, and eastward the uncovered mud and wet sand, bared by the tide ebbing beyond Montrose, stretched along its shores to the town. The fall of the broom-covered bank was steep enough to hide anyone coming up from the lower levels, and he listened to the movements of somebody who was approaching and to the crackling noise of the bushes as they were thrust apart. The sound stopped, and Archie, leaning forward, saw James standing halfway up the ascent, with his back turned towards him, looking out across the flats. He knew what his thoughts were. He drew his right sleeve lower. So long as he did not stretch out his arm, the mark could not be seen. He did not want to appear as if he were watching Logie, so he made a slight sound, and the other turned quickly and faced him, hidden from the waist downwards in the broom. Then his crooked lip moved, and he came up the bank and threw himself down beside Flemington. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 7. Treachery. James did not look as if he had been up all night, though he had spent the most part of it on foot with Ferrier. The refreshment of morning had bathed him too, but he was still harassed in mind by some of the occurrences of the last few hours. Last night he had seen the mark on the wrist stretch suddenly between himself and his friend, and had understood its significance. It was the mark that he had put there. As the two men listened to the flying footsteps that mystified them by their doublings in the darkness, it had dawned upon them that the intruder skulking behind the windlass and the tipsy reveller prone in the close were one and the same person. The drunkard was a very daring spy, as sober as themselves. "You are out betimes," said Archie, with friendly innocence. "I often am," replied James simply. Archie pulled up a blade of grass and began to chew it meditatively. "I see your long night has done you good," began Logie. "There were many things I should have liked to ask you yesterday evening, but you went away so early that I could not." Silence dropped upon the two, upon Logie because his companion's manner last night had hinted at remembrances buried in regret and painful to dig up; on Flemington because he knew the value of that impression, and because he would fain put off the moment when the more complete deception of the man whose sympathetic attitude he divined and whose generosity of soul was so obvious must begin. He did not want to come to close quarters with James. He had hunted him and been hunted by him, but he had not yet been obliged to lie to him by word of mouth, and he had no desire to do so here and now in cold blood and in the face of all this beauty and peace. "I could not but be interested in what you said," continued the other. "You did not tell us whether you had been at St. Germain yourself." "Never," replied Archie. "I was sent to Scotland at 8 years old, and I have been here ever since." He had taken the plunge now, for he had been backwards and forwards to France several times in the last few years, since he had begun to work for King George, employed in watching the movements of suspicious persons between one country and the other. He looked down on the ground. The more he hesitated to speak, the more he knew that he would impress James. He understood the delicacy of his companion's feeling by instinct. It was not only dissimulation which bade him act thus, it was the real embarrassment and discomfort which were creeping on him under the eyes of the honourable soldier. All the same, he hoped that his reluctant silence would save him. "You think me impertinent," said Logie, "but do not be afraid that I mean to pry. I know how hard life can be and how anxious nowadays. There is so much loss and trouble. God knows what may happen to this tormented country, but trouble does not seem natural when a man is young and light-hearted as you are." Archie was collecting materials wherewith to screen himself from his companion's sympathy. It would be easy to tell him some rigmarole of early suffering, of want endured for the cause which had lain dormant, yet living since the unsuccessful rising of the 15, of the devotion to it of the parents he had scarcely known, of the bitterness of their exile, but somehow he could not force himself to do it. He remembered those parents principally as vague people who were ceaselessly playing cards, and whose quarrels had terrified him when he was small. His real interest in life had begun when he arrived at Ardguys and made the acquaintance of his grandmother, whose fascination he had felt, in common with most other male creatures. He had had a joyous youth, and he knew it. He had run the pastures, climbed the trees, fished the Kilpie burn, and known every country pleasure dear to boyhood. If he had been solitary, he had yet been perfectly happy. He had gone to Edinburgh at 17, at his own ardent wish, to learn painting, not as a profession, but as a pastime. His prospects were comfortable, for Madam Flemington had made him her heir, and she had relations settled in England who were always ready to bid him welcome when he crossed the border. Life had been consistently pleasant, and had grown exciting since the beginning of his work for government. He wished to heaven he had not met James this morning. But to Logie, Archie was merely a youth of undoubted good breeding, struggling bravely for his bread in an almost menial profession, and he honoured him for what he deemed his courage. There was no need to seek a reason for his poverty after hearing his words last night. His voice, when he spoke of his father's death in exile, had implied all that was necessary to establish a claim on James's generous and rather bigoted heart. For him, there were only two kinds of men, those who were for the Stuarts and those who were not. People were very reticent about their political feelings in those days, some from pure caution, and some because these lay so deep under mountains of personal loss and misfortune. "I dare not look back," said Archie at last. "I have to live by my trade and fight the world with my brush. You live by sticking your sword into its entrails, and I by painting its face a better colour than nature chose for it. And I think yours is the pleasanter calling of the two. But I am grateful to mine all the same, and now it has procured me the acquaintance of his lordship and the pleasure of being where I am, I need not tell you that I find myself in clover." "I am heartily glad of it," said James. "Indeed, so am I," rejoined Archie, pleased at having turned the conversation so deftly, "for you cannot think what strange things happen to a man who has no recognized place in the minds of respectable people." James rolled over on his chest, leaning on his elbows, and looked up at his companion sitting just above him, with his dark, silky head clear cut against the background of green bush. The young man's words seemed to trip out and pirouette with impudent jauntiness in their hearer's face. Logie did not know that Archie's management of these puppets was a part of his charm. His detached points of view were restful to a man like James, one continually preoccupied by large issues. It was difficult to think of responsibilities in Archie's presence. "You might never imagine how much I am admired below stairs," said the latter. "While I painted a lady in the south, I was expected to eat with the servants, and the attentions of a kitchen girl all but cost me my life. I found a challenge, offering me the choice of weapons in the most approved manner, under my dish of porridge. It came from a groom." "What did you do?" asked James, astounded. "I chose warming pans," said Archie, "and that ended the matter." James laughed aloud, but there was bitterness in his mirth, and this was a man born at St. Germain. "We laugh," said he, "but such a life could have been no laughing matter to you." "But I assure you it was. What else could I do?" "You could have left the place," began James. Then he stopped short, remembering that beggars cannot be choosers. His expression was not lost on Archie, who saw that the boat he had steered so carefully into the shallows was drawing out to deep water again, and that he had used his luxuriant imagination to small purpose. He had so little self-consciousness that to keep James's interest upon himself was no temptation to him, though it might have been to some men. He cast about for something wherewith to blot his own figure from the picture. "And you," he said gravely, "you who think so much of my discomforts, and who have actually wielded the sword while I have merely threatened to wield the warming pan, you must have seen stranger things than the kitchen." "I?" said James, looking fixedly out to where the town steeple threw its reflection on the wet sand. "Yes, I have seen things that I hope you will never see. It is not for me to speak ill of war, I who have turned to it for consolation as a man may turn to his religion. But war is not waged against men alone in some countries. I have seen it when it is waged against women and little children, when it is slaughter, not war. I have seen mothers, young, beautiful women, fighting like wild beasts for the poor babes that cowered behind their skirts, and I have seen their bodies afterwards. It would be best to forget, but who can forget? Archie sat still, with eyes from which all levity had vanished. He had known vaguely that James had fought under Marshal Lacy in the War of the Polish Succession, in the bloody campaign against the Turks, and again in Finland. The ironic futility of things in general struck him, for it was absurd to think that this man, seared by war and wise in the realities of events whose rumour shook Europe, one who had looked upon death daily in company with men like Peter Lacy, should come home to be hunted down back streets by a travelling painter. He contemplated his companion with renewed interest. No wonder he was ruthless in small things. He was decidedly the most fascinating person he had known. "And you went to these things for consolation, so you said?" "For consolation. For a thing that does not exist," said the other slowly. He paused and turned to his companion with an expression that horrified the young man and paralysed his curiosity. The power in his face seemed to have given way, revealing for a moment a defencelessness, like the defencelessness of a child looking upon the dark, and it told Archie that there was something that even Logie dreaded, and that something was memory. The deep places he had guessed in James's soul were deep indeed, and again Flemington was struck with humility, for his own unimportance and contrast with this experienced man seemed little less than pitiful. The feeling closed his lips, and he looked round at the shortening shadows and into the stir of coming sunlight as a man looks round for a door through which to escape from impending stress. He, who was always ready to go forward, recoiled because of what he foresaw in himself. His self-confidence was ebbing, for he was afraid of how much he might be turned out of his way by the influence on him of Logie. He wished that he could force their talk into a different channel, but his ready wits, for once, would not answer the call. Something not understood by him was moving James to expression, as reserved men are compelled towards it at times. Perhaps the bygone youth in him rose up in response to the youth at his side. The many years dividing him from his brother, the judge, had never consciously troubled him in their intercourse, but the tremendous divergence in their respective characters had thrown him back upon himself. Archie seemed to have the power of turning a key that Balnillo had never held. "But I am putting you out of conceit with the world," cried James abruptly. "Let no one do that. Take all you can, Flemington. I did. I took it all. Love, roistering, good company, good wine, good play, all came to me, and I had my belly full. There were merry times in Holland with the Scots Brigade. It was the best part of my life, and I went to it young. I was 16 the day I stood up on parade for the first time." "I have often had a mind to invade Holland," observed Archie, grasping eagerly at the impersonal part of the subject. "It would be paradise to one of my trade. The very thought of a windmill weaves a picture for me, and those strange striped flowers the Dutchmen raise. I cannot think of their names now. I would give much to see them growing. You must have seen them in every variety and hue." "Ay, I saw the tulips," said James in a strange voice. "The Dutchmen can paint them too," said Archie hurriedly. "What devil makes you talk of tulips?" cried James. "Fate painted the tulips for me. Oh, Flemington, Flemington, in every country, in every march, in every fight, among dead and dying, and among dancers and the music they danced to, I have seen nothing but those gaudy flowers, beds of them growing like a woven carpet, and Diane among them." No feminine figure had come into the background against which stood Archie's conception of Logie. "Diane!" he exclaimed involuntarily. James did not seem to hear him. "Her eyes were like yours," he went on. "When I saw you come into the light of the house 2 evenings since, I thought of her." Neither spoke for a few moments. Then James went on again. "14 years since the day I saw her last. She looked out at me from the window with her eyes full of tears. The window was filled with flowers. She loved them. The tulips were there again, crimson tulips, with her white face behind them." Flemington listened with parted lips. His personal feelings, his shrinking dread of being drawn into the confidence of the man whom it was his business to betray, were swallowed by a wave of interest. "I was no more than a boy, with my head full of cards and women and horses, and every devilry under heaven, when I went to the house among the canals. The Comte de Montdelys had built it, for he lived in Holland a part of the year to grow his tulips. He was a rich man, a hard, old, pinched Frenchman, but his passion was tulip growing, and their cultivation was a new thing. It was a great sight to see the gardens he had planned at the water's edge, with every colour reflected from the beds, and the green shuttered house in the middle. Even the young men of the brigade were glad to spend an afternoon looking upon the show, and the Comte would invite now one and now another. He loved to strut about, exhibiting his gardens. Diane was his daughter. My poor Diane! Flemington, do I weary you?" "No, no, indeed," cried Archie, who had been lost, wandering in an enchanted labyrinth of bloom and colour as he listened. The image of the house rising from among its waterways was as vivid to him as if he had seen it with bodily eyes. "She was so young," said the soldier, "so gentle, so little suited to such as I. But she loved me, God knows why. And she was brave, brave to the end as she lay dying by the roadside, and sending me her love." He stopped and turned away. Archie could say nothing, for his throat had grown thick. Logie's unconscious gift of filling his words with drama, a gift which is most often given to those who suspect it least, wrought on him. James looked round, staring steadily and blindly over his companion's shoulder. "I took her away," he went on, as though describing another man's experiences. "There was no choice, for the Comte would not tolerate me. I was a Protestant, and I was poor, and there was a rich Spaniard whom he favoured. So we went. We were married in Breda, and for a year we lived in peace. Such days, such days! The Comte made no sign, and I thought in my folly he would let us alone. It seemed as though we had gained paradise at last, but I did not know him, Montdelys. Then the boy was born. When he was 2 months old, I was obliged to come back to Scotland. It was a matter concerning money which could not be delayed, for my little fortune had to be made doubly secure now, and I got leave from my regiment. I could not take Diane and the child, and I left them at Breda, safe, as I thought. At 23 we do not know men, not the endless treachery of them. Flemington, when God calls us all to judgment, there will be no mercy for treachery." Archie's eyes, fixed on the other pair, whose keen grey light was blurred with pain, dropped. He breathed hard, and his nostrils quivered. "You seem to me as young as I was then. May God preserve you from man's treachery. He did not preserve me," said James. "I do not know how Montdelys knew that she was defenceless," continued he, "but I think there must have been some spy of his watching us. As soon as I had left Holland, he sent to her to say he was ill, probably dying, and that he had forgiven all. He longed for the sight of the boy, and he asked her to bring him, that he might see his grandchild. She was to make her home with him while I was absent, and he would send word to me to join them on my return. Diane sent me the good news and went, fearing nothing, to find herself a prisoner. And all this time he had been working, he and the Spaniard, to get the Pope to annul our marriage, and they had succeeded. What they said to her, what they did, I know not, and never shall know, but they could not shake Diane. I was on my way back to Holland when she managed to escape with the boy. Storms in the North Sea delayed me, but I was not disturbed, knowing her to be safe. I did not know when I landed at last that she was dead. She swam the canal, Flemington, with the child tied on her shoulders, and the brother officer of mine, a man in my own company, whom she had contrived to communicate with, was waiting for her with a carriage. My regiment had moved to Bergen op Zoom, and he meant to take her there. He had arranged it with the wife of my colonel, who was to give her shelter till I arrived and could protect her myself. They had gone more than halfway to Bergen when they were overtaken early in the morning. She was shot, Flemington. The bullet was meant for Carmichael, the man who was with her, but it struck Diane. They laid her on the grass at the roadside, and she died, holding Carmichael's hand and sending. He stopped. "And the child?" said Archie at last. "Carmichael brought him to Bergen with his mother. He did not live. The bullet had grazed his poor little body as he lay in her arms, and the exposure did the rest. They are buried at Bergen." Again Archie was speechless. "I killed the Spaniard," said James. Could not reach Montdelys. He was too old to be able to settle his differences in the world of men. Archie did not know what to do. He longed with a bitter longing to show his companion something of what he felt, to give him some sign of the passion of sympathy which had shaken him as he listened, but his tongue was tied fast by the blighting knowledge of his true position, and to approach by so much as a step seemed only to blacken his soul and to load it yet more heavily with a treachery as vile as that which had undone James. "I could not endure Holland afterwards," continued Logie. "Once I had looked on that Spanish hound's dead body, my work was done. I left the Scots Brigade and took service with Russia, and I joined Peter Lacy, who was on his way to fight in Poland. Fighting was all I wanted, and God knows I had it. I did not want to be killed, but to kill. Then I grew weary of that, but I still stayed with Lacy and followed him to fight the Turks. We outlive trouble in time, Flemington. We outlive it, though we cannot outlive memory. We outlast it. That is a better word. I have outlasted, perhaps outlived. I can turn and look back upon myself as though I were another being. It is only when some chance word or circumstance brings my youth back in detail that I can scarce bear it. You have brought it back, Flemington, and this morning I am face to face with it again." "It does not sound as if you had outlived it," said the young man. "Life is made of many things," said James. "Whether we have lost our all or not, we have to plough on to the end, and it is best to plough on merrily. Lacy never complained of me as a companion in the long time we were together, for I was on his staff, and I took all that came to me, as I have done always. There were some mad fellows among us, and I was no saner than they, but life is quiet enough here in the year since I came home to my good brother." The mention of Lord Balnillo made Flemington start. "Gad!" he exclaimed, rising, thankful for escape. "And I am to begin the portrait this morning, and have set out none of my colours." "And I have gone breakfastless," said Logie with a smile. "And worse than that, I've spoilt the sunshine for you with my tongue that should have been silent." "No, no!" burst out Flemington rather hoarsely. "Don't think of that. If you only knew—" He stood, unable to finish his sentence or to utter one word of comfort without plunging deeper into self-abhorrence. "I must go," he stammered. "I must leave you and run." James laid a detaining hand on him. "Listen, Flemington," he said. "Listen before you go. We have learnt something of each other, you and I. Promise me that if ever you should find yourself in such a position as the one you spoke of, if you should come to such a strait as that, if a little help could make you free, you will come to me as if I were your brother. Your eyes are so like Diane's, you might well be hers." Archie stood before him, dumb, as James held out his hand. He grasped it for a moment, then turned from him in a tumult of horror and despair. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob, Chapter 8. The Heavy Hand. It was on the following day that Lord Balnillo stood in front of a 3/4 length canvas in the improvised studio. Archie had begun to put on the colour that morning, and the judge had come quietly upstairs to study the first dawnings of his own countenance alone. From the midst of a chaos of paint, his features were beginning to appear like the sun through a fog. He had brought a small hand glass with him, tucked away under his velvet coat where it could not be seen, and he now produced it and began to compare his face with the one before him. Flemington was a quick worker, and though he had been given only 2 sittings, there was enough on the canvas to prompt the gratified smile on the old man's lips. He looked alternately at his reflection and at the judicial figure on the easel. Archie had a tactful brush. But though Balnillo was pleased, he could not help sighing, for he wished fervently that his ankles had been included in the picture. He stooped and ran his hand lovingly down his silk stockings. Then he took up the glass again and began to compose his expression into the rather more lofty one with which Flemington had supplied him. In the full swing of his occupation, he turned round to find the painter standing in the doorway, but he was just too late to catch the sudden flash of amusement that played across Archie's face as he saw what the judge was doing. Balnillo thrust the glass out of sight and confronted his guest. "I thought you had gone for a stroll, sir," he said rather stiffly. "My lord," exclaimed Flemington, "I've been searching for you everywhere. I've come, with infinite regret, to tell you that I must return to Ardguys at once." Balnillo's jaw dropped. "I have just met a messenger on the road," said the other. "He has brought news that my grandmother is taken ill, and I must hurry home. It is most unfortunate, most disappointing, but go I must." "Tut, tut, tut!" exclaimed the old man, clicking his tongue against his teeth and forgetting to hope, as politeness decreed he should, that the matter was not serious. "It is a heart attack," said Archie. "Tut, tut!" said Balnillo again. "I am most distressed to hear it. I am indeed. I may be able to come back and finish the picture later." "I hope so. I sincerely hope so. I was just studying the admirable likeness when you came in," said Balnillo, who would have given a great deal to know how much of his posturing Flemington had seen. "Ah, my lord," cried Archie, "a poor devil like me has no chance with you. I saw the mirror in your hand. We painters use a piece of looking glass to correct our drawings, but it is few of our sitters who know that trick." Guilty dismay was chased by relief across Balnillo's countenance. "You are too clever for me," laughed Flemington. "How did you learn it, may I ask?" But Balnillo had got his presence of mind back. "Casually, Mr. Flemington, casually, as one learns many things if one keeps one's ears open," said he. A couple of hours later, Archie was on his way home. He had left one horse, still disabled, in the judge's stable, and he was riding the other into Brechin, where he would get a fresh one to take him on. Balnillo had persuaded him to leave his belongings where they were until he knew what chance there was of an early return. He had parted from Archie with reluctance. Although the portrait was the old man's principal interest, its maker counted for much with him, for it was some time since his ideas had been made to move, as they always moved in Flemington's presence. The judge got much pleasure out of his own curiosity and the element of the unexpected. That fascinating factor which had been introduced into domestic life was a continual joy. Balnillo had missed it more than he knew, since he had become a completely rural character. Archie saw the basin of Montrose drop behind him as he rode away with a stir of mixed feelings. The net that Logie had, in all ignorance, spread for him had entangled his feet. He had never conceived a like situation, and it startled him to discover that a difficulty, nowhere touching the tangible, could be so potent, so disastrous. He felt like a man who has been tripped up and who suddenly finds himself on the ground. He had risen and fled. The position had become intolerable. He told himself in his impetuous way that it was more than he could bear, and now every bit of luck he had turned to account, every precaution he had taken, all the ingenuity he had used to land himself in the hostile camp, were to go for nothing, because some look in his face, some droop of the eyes, had reminded another man of his own past, and had let loose in him an overwhelming impulse to expression. "Remember what I told you yesterday," had been James's last words, as Flemington put his foot in the stirrup. "There must be no more challenges." It was that high-coloured flower of his own imagination, the picture of himself in the servants' hall, that had finally accomplished his defeat. How could he betray the man who was ready to share his purse with him? And, putting the matter of the purse aside, his painter's imagination was set alight. The glow of the tulips and the strange house by the winding water, the slim vision of Diane de Michaelides, the gallant backdrop of the Scots Brigade, the grave at Bergen op Zoom, these things were like a mirage behind the figure of James. The power of seeing things picturesquely is a gift that can turn into a curse, and that power worked on his emotional and imaginative side now. And furthermore, beyond what might be called the ornamental part of his difficulty, he realized that friendship with James, had he been free to offer or to accept it, would have been a lifelong prize. They had spent the preceding day together after the sitting was over, and though Logie had opened his heart no more, and their talk had been of the common interests of men's lives, it had strengthened Archie's resolve to end the situation and to save himself while there was yet time. There was nothing for it but flight. He had told the judge that he would try to return, but he did not mean to enter the gates of Balnillo again, not while the country was seething with Prince Charlie's plots. Perhaps never. He would remember James all his life, but he hoped that their ways might never cross again. And behind that there was regret, regret for the friend who might have been his, who, in his secret heart, would be his always. He could, even now, hardly realize that he had been actually turned from his purpose. It seemed to him incredible. But there was one thing more incredible still, and that was that he could raise his hand to strike again at the man who had been stricken so terribly, and with the same weapon of betrayal. It would be as if James lay wounded on a battlefield, and he should come by to stab him anew. The blow he should deal him would have nothing to do with the past, but Archie felt that James had so connected him in mind with the memory of the woman he resembled, had, by that one burst of confidence, given him so much part in the sacred kingdom of remembrance wherein she dwelt, that it would be almost as if something from out of the past had struck at him across her grave. Archie sighed, weary and sick with fate's ironic jests. There were some things he could not do. The two men had avoided politics, though Flemington's insinuations had conveyed to the brothers that he was like-minded with themselves. The prince's name was not mentioned. There was so much brewing in James's brain that the very birds of the air must not hear. Sorry as he was when Flemington met him with the news of his unexpected recall, he had decided that it was well the young man should go. When this time of stress was over, when and if the cause he served should prevail, he would seek out Archie. The if was very clear to James, for he had seen enough of men and causes, of troops and campaigns, and the practical difficulties of great movements, to know that he was spending himself in what might well be a forlorn hope. But none the less was he determined to see it through, for his heart was deep in it, and besides that, he had the temperament that is attracted by forlorn hopes. He was a reticent man in spite of the opening of that page in his life which he had laid before Flemington, and reticent characters are often those most prone to rare and unexpected bouts of self-revelation. But when the impulse has passed, and the load ever present with them has been lighted for a moment, they will thrust it yet farther back behind the door of their lips, and give the key a double turn. He had enjoined Flemington to come to him as he would come to a brother for assistance, and it had seemed to Archie that life would have little more to offer had it only given him a brother like James. A cloud was on his spirit as he neared Brechin. When he left the inn and would have paid the landlord, he thrust his hand into his pocket to discover a thin sealed packet at the bottom of it. He drew it out and found to his surprise that although his name was on it, it was unopened, and that he had never seen it before. While he turned it over, something told him that the unknown handwriting it bore was that of James Logie. The coat he wore had hung in the hall at Balnillo since the preceding night, and the packet must have been slipped into it before he started. As he rode along, he broke the seal. The paper it contained had neither beginning nor signature, yet he knew that his guess was right. "You will be surprised at finding this," he read, "but I wish you to read it when there are some miles between us. In these disturbed days it is not possible to tell when we may meet again. Should you return, I may be here or I may be gone God knows where, and for reasons of which I need not speak, my brother may be the last man to know where I am. But for the sake of all I spoke of yesterday, I ask you to believe that I am your friend. Do not forget that, in any strait, I am at your back. Because it is true, I give you these two directions. A message carried to Rob Smith's tavern in the Castle Wynd at Stirling will reach me eventually, wheresoever I am. Nearer home you may hear of me also. There is a little house on the Muir of Pert, the only house on the north side of the Muir, a mile west of the fir wood. The man who lives there is in constant touch with me. If you should find yourself in urgent need, I will send you the sum of £100 through him. Flemington, you will make no hesitation in the matter. You will take it for the sake of one I have spoken of to none but you these years and years past." And now he had to go home and to tell Madam Flemington that he had wantonly thrown away all the advantages gained in the last 3 days, that he had tossed them to the wind for a mere sentimental scruple. So far he had never quarrelled with his occupation, but now, because it had brought him up against a soldier of fortune whose existence he had been unaware of a few weeks ago, he had sacrificed it and played a sorry trick on his own prospects at the same time. He was trusted and valued by his own party, and in spite of his youth, had given it excellent service again and again. He could hardly expect the determined woman who had made him what he was to see eye to eye with him. Christian Flemington had kept her supremacy over her grandson. Parental authority was a much stronger thing in the mid-18th century than it is now, and she stood in the position of a parent to him. His French blood and her long residence in France had made their relationship something like that of a French mother and son, and she had all his confidence in his young man's scrapes, for she recognized phases of life that are apt to be ignored by English parents in dealing with their children. She had cut him loose from her apron strings early, but she had moulded him with infinite care before she let him go. There was a touch of genius in Archie, a flicker of what she called the feu sacre, and she kept it burning before her own shrine. The fine unscrupulousness that was her main characteristic, her manner of breasting the tide of circumstance full sail, awed and charmed him. For all his boldness and initiative, his devil-may-care independence of will, and his originality in the conduct of his affairs, he had never freed his inner self from her thrall, and she held him by the strong impression she had made on his imagination years and years ago. She had set her mark upon the plastic character of the little boy whom she had beaten for painting Mr. Duthie's gatepost. That was an episode which he had never forgotten, which he always thought of with a smile, and while he remembered the sting of her cane, he also remembered her masterly routing of his enemy before she applied it. She had punished him with a thoroughness that was hers, but she had never allowed the minister to know what she had done. Technically, she had been on the side of the angels, but in reality she had stood by the culprit. In spirit, they had resented Mr. Duthie together. He slept at Forfar that night, and pushed on again next morning. And as he saw the old house across the dip and heard the purl of the burn at the end of his journey, something in his heart failed him. The liquid whisper of the water through the fine rush-like grass spoke to him of childhood, and of the time when there was no world but Ardguys, no monarch but Madam Flemington. He seemed to feel her influence coming out to meet him at every step his horse took. How could he tell his news? How could he explain what he had done? They had never touched on ethical questions, he and she. As he came up the muddy road between the ash trees, he felt the chilly throe, the intense spiritual discomfort that attends our plunges from one atmosphere into another. It is the penalty of those who live their lives with every nerve and fibre, who take fervent part in the lives of other people, to suffer acutely in the struggle to loose themselves from an environment they have just quitted, and to meet an impending one without distress. But it is no disproportionate price to pay for learning life as a whole. Also, it is the only price accepted. He put his horse into the stable and went to the garden, being told that Madam Flemington was there. The day was warm and bright, and as he swung the gate to behind him, he saw her sitting on a seat at the angle of the farther wall. She rose at the click of the latch and came up the grass path to meet him between a line of espalier apple trees and a row of phlox on which October had still left a few red and white blossoms. The 18 years that had gone by since the episode of the manse gatepost had not done much to change her appearance. The shrinking and obliterating of personality which comes with the passing of middle life had not begun its work on her, and at 61 she was more imposing than ever. She had grown a great deal stouter, but the distribution of flesh had been even, and she carried her bulk with a kind of self-conscious triumph, as a ship carries her canvas. A brown silk mantle woven with a pattern of flower bouquets was round her shoulders, and she held its thick folds together with one hand. In the other she carried the book she had been reading. Her hair was as abundant as ever, and had grown no whiter. The sun struck on it silver and red flashes came from the rubies in her ears. She said nothing as Archie approached, but her eyes spoke inquiry, and a shadow of softness flickered over so slightly round her broad lips. She was pleased to see him, but the shadow was caused less by her affection for him than by her appreciation of the charming figure he presented, seen thus suddenly and advancing with so much grace of movement in the sunlight. She stopped short when he was within a few steps of her, and dropping her book upon the ground without troubling to see where it fell, held out her hand for him to kiss. He touched it with his lips, and then, thrusting his arm into the phlox bushes, drew out the volume that had landed among them. From between the leaves dropped a folded paper, on which he recognized his own handwriting. "This is a surprise," said Madam Flemington, looking her grandson up and down. "I have ridden. My baggage is left at Balnillo." The moment of explanation would have to come, but his desire was to put it off as long as possible. "There is your letter between the pages of my book," said she. "It came to me this morning, and I was reading it again. It gave me immense pleasure, Archie. I suppose you have come to search for the clothes you mentioned. I'm glad to see you, my dear, but it is a long ride to take for a few pairs of stockings." "You should see Balnillo's hose!" exclaimed Flemington hurriedly. "I'll be bound the old buck's spindle shanks cost him as much as his estate. If he had as many legs as a centipede, he would have them all in silk." "And not a petticoat about the place?" "None nearer than the kitchen." "He should have stayed in Edinburgh," said Madam Flemington, laughing. She loved Archie's society. "I hear that this Captain Logie is one of the most dangerous rebels in Scotland," she went on. "If you can lay him by the heels, it is a service that will not be forgotten. So far you have done mighty well, Archie." They had reached the gate, and she laid her hand on his arm. "Turn back," she said. "I must consult you. I suppose that now you will be kept for some time at Balnillo. That nest of treason, Montrose, will give you occupation, and you must stretch out the portrait to match your convenience. I am going to take advantage of it too. I shall go to Edinburgh while you're away." "To Edinburgh?" exclaimed Flemington. "Why not, pray?" "But you leave Ardguys so seldom. It is years." "The more reason I should go now," interrupted she. "Among other things, I must see my man of business, and I have decided to do it now. I shall be more useful to you in Edinburgh, too. I have been too long out of personal touch with those who can advance your interests. I had a letter from Edinburgh yesterday. You are better thought of there than you suspect, Archie. I did not realize how important a scoundrel this man Logie is, nor what your despatch to Montrose implied." He was silent, looking on the ground. She knew every turn of Archie's manner, every inflection of his voice. There was a gathering sign of opposition on his face, the phantom of some mood that must not be allowed to gain an instant's strength. It flashed on her that he had not returned merely to fetch his clothes. There was something wrong. She knew that at this moment he was afraid of her, he who was afraid of nothing else. She stopped in the path and drew herself up, considering where she should strike. Never, never had she failed to bring him to his bearings. There was only one fitting place for him, and that was in the hollow of her hand. "Grandmother, I shall not go back to Balnillo," he said vehemently. If the earth had risen up under her feet, Madam Flemington could not have been more astonished. She stood immovable, looking at him, whilst an inward voice, flying through her mind like a snatch of broken sound, told her that she must keep her head. She made no feeble mistake in that moment, for she saw the vital importance of the conflict impending between them with clear eyes. She knew her back to be nearer the wall than it had been yet. Her mind was as agile as her body was, by nature indolent, and it was always ready to turn in any direction and look any foe squarely in the face. She was startled, but she could not be shaken. "I've left Balnillo for good," said he again. "I cannot go back. I will not." "You will not?" said Kristin, half closing her eyes. The pupils had contracted and looked like tiny black beads set in a narrow glitter of grey. "Is that what you have come home to say to me?" "It is impossible," he cried, turning away and flinging out his arms. "It is more than I can do. I will not go man hunting after Logie. I will go anywhere else, do anything else, but not that." "There is nothing else for you to do. Then I will come back here." "That you will not," said Kristin. He drew in his breath as if he had been struck. "What are you that you should betray me, and yet think to force yourself on me without my resenting it? What do you think I am that I should suffer it?" She laughed. "I have not betrayed you," said he in a husky voice. The loyal worship he had given her unquestioningly through the long dependence and the small but poignant vicissitudes of childhood came back on him like a returning tide and doubled the cruelty of her words. She was the one person against whom he felt unable to defend himself. He loved her truly, and the thought of absolute separation from her came over him like a chill. "I did not think you could speak to me in this way. It is terrible," he said. His dark eyes were full of pain. He spoke as simply as a little boy. Satisfaction stole back to her. She had not lost her hold on him, and would not lose it. Another woman might have flung an affectionate word into the balance to give the final clip to the scale, but she never thought of doing that. Neither impulse nor calculation suggested it, because affection was not the weapon she was accustomed to trust. Her faith was in the heavy hand. Her generalship was good enough to tell her the exact moment of wavering in the enemy in front, the magic instant for a fresh attack. "You are a bitter disappointment," she said. "Life has brought me many, but you are the greatest. I have had to go without some necessities in my time, and I now shall have to go without you, but I can do it, and I will." "You mean that you will turn from me altogether? Am I not plain enough? I can be plainer if you like. You shall go out of this house and go where you will. I do not care where you go. But you are forgetting that I have some curiosity. I wish to understand what has happened to you since you wrote your letter. That is excusable, surely." "It is Logie," said he. "He has made it impossible for me. I cannot cheat a man who has given me all his confidence." "He gave you his confidence!" cried Madam Flemington. "Heavens! He is well served, that stage puppet prince, when his servants confide in the first stranger they meet. Captain Logie must be a man of honour." "He is," said Archie. "It was his own private confidence he gave me. I heard his own history from his own lips, and, knowing it, I cannot go on deceiving him. I like him too much." Madam Flemington was confounded. The difficulty seemed so strangely puerile. A whim, a fancy, was to ruin the work of years and turn everything upside down. On the top she was exasperated with Archie, but underneath it was worse. She found her influence and her power at stake, and her slave was being wrested from her, in spite of every interest which had bound them together. She loved him with a jealous, untender love that was dependent on outward circumstances, and she was proud of him. She had smiled at his devotion to her as she would have smiled with gratified comprehension at the fidelity of a favourite dog, understanding the creature's justifiable feeling and knowing how creditable it was to its intelligence. "What has all this to do with your duty?" she demanded. "My duty is too hard," he cried. "I cannot do it, grandmother." Too hard!" she exclaimed. "Pah! You weary me. You disgust me. I am sick of you, Archie." His lip quivered, and he met her eyes with a mist of dazed trouble in his own. A black curtain seemed to be falling between them. "I told him every absurdity I could imagine," said he. "I made him believe that I was dependent upon my work for my daily bread. I did not think he would take my lies as he did. His kindness was so great, so generous. Grandmother, he would have had me promise to go to him for help. How can I spy upon him and cheat him after that?" He stopped. He could not tell her more, for he knew that the mention of the £100 would but make her more angry. The details of what Logie had written could be given to no one. He was only waiting for an opportunity to destroy the paper he carried. "We have to do with principles, not men," said Madam Flemington. "He is a rebel to his king. If I thought you were so much as dreaming of going over to those worthless Stuarts, I would never see you nor speak to you again. I would sooner see you dead. Is that what is in your mind?" "There is nothing farther from my thoughts," said he. "I can have no part with the rebels. I am a Whig, and I shall always be a Whig. I have told you the plain truth." "And now I will tell you the plain truth," said Madam Flemington. "While I am alive, you will not enter Ardguys. When you cut yourself off from me, you will do so finally. I will have no half measures, as I have no half sentiments. I have bred you up to support King George's interests against the whole band of paupers at St. Germain, that you may pay a part of the debt of injury they laid upon me and mine. Mary Beatrice took my son from me. You do not know what you have to thank her for, Archie, but I will tell you now. You have to thank her that your mother was a girl of the people, of the streets, a slut taken into the palace out of charity. She was forced on my son by the Queen and her favourite, Lady Despard. That was how they rewarded us, my husband and me, for our fidelity. He was in his grave and knew nothing, but I was there. I am here still, and I remember still." The little muscles round her strong lips were quivering. Archie had never seen Madam Flemington so much disturbed, and it was something of a shock to him to find that the power he had known always as self-dependent, aloof, unruffled, could be at the mercy of so much feeling. Lady Despard was one of that Irish rabble that followed King James along with better people, a woman given over to prayers and confessions and priests. She is dead, thank God. It was she who took your mother out of the gutter, where she sang from door to door, meaning to make none of her, for her voice was remarkable, and she and her priests would have trained her for a convent choir. But the girl had no stomach for a nunnery. The back stairs of the palace pleased her better, and the Queen took her into her household and would have her sing to her in her own chamber. She was handsome, too, and she hid the devil that was in her from the women. The men knew her better, and the Chevalier and your father knew her best of all. But at last Lady Despard got wind of it. They dared not turn her into the streets for fear of the priests, and to save her own son, the Queen sacrificed mine." She stopped, looking to see the effect of her words. Archie was very pale. "Is my true name Flemington?" he asked abruptly. "You are my own flesh and blood," said she, "or you would not be standing here." Their fear was that the Chevalier would marry her privately, but they got him out of the way, and your father seduced the girl. Then, to make the Chevalier doubly safe, they forced him to make her his wife. He who was only 19. They did it secretly, but when the marriage was known, I would not receive her, and I left the court and went to Rouen. I've lived there ever since in the hope of seeing the Stuarts swept from the earth. Your father is gone, and you are all I have left. But you shall go too if you join yourself to them." "I shall not do that," said he. "Do you understand now what it costs me to see you turn back?" said Madam Flemington. The mantle had slipped from her shoulders, and her white hands, crossed at the wrists, lay with the fingers along her arms. She stood trying to dissect the component parts of his trouble, and to fashion something out of them on which she might make a new attack. Forces outside her own understanding were at work in him, which were strong enough to take the fine edge of humiliation off the history she had just told him. She guessed their presence, unseen though they were, and her acute practical mind was searching for them. She was like an astronomer whose telescope is turned on the tract of sky in which, as his science tells him, some unknown body will arise. She had always taken his pride of race for granted, as she took her own. The influx of the base blood of the slut had been a mortification unspeakable, but to Madam Flemington the actual treachery practised on her had not been the crowning insult. The thing was bad, but the manner of its doing was worse, for the Queen and Lady Despard had used young Flemington as though he had been of no account. The Flemingtons had served James Stuart wholeheartedly, taking his evil fortunes as though they had been their own. They had done it of their own free will, high-handedly. But Mary Beatrice and her favourite had treated Kristin and her son as slaves, chattels to be sacrificed to the needs of their owner. There was enough nobility in Kristin to see that part of the business as its blackest spot. She had kept the knowledge of it from Archie, because she had the instinct common to all savage creatures, and Kristin's affinity with savage creatures was a close one, for the concealment of desperate wounds. Her silks, her ruby earrings, her physical indolence, her white hands, all the refinements that had accrued to her in her world-loving life, all that went to make the outward presentment of the woman, was the mere ornamental covering of the savage in her. That savage watched Archie now. Madam Flemington was removed by 2 generations from Archie, and there was a gulf of evolution between them, unrealized by either. Their conscious ideals might be identical, but their unconscious ideals, those that count with nations and with individuals, were different. And the same trouble, one that might be accepted and acknowledged by each, must affect each differently. The old regard a tragedy through its influences on the past, and the young through its influences on the future. To Archie, Madam Flemington's revelation was an insignificant thing compared to the horror that was upon him now. It was done, and it could not be undone, and he was himself with his life before him in spite of it. It was like the withered leaf of a poisonous plant, a thing rendered innocuous by the processes of nature. What process of nature could make his agony innocuous? The word treachery had become a nightmare to him, and on every side he was fated to hear it. Its full meaning had only been brought home to him 2 days ago, and now the hateful thing was being pressed on him by one who had suffered from it bitterly. What could he say to her? How was he to make her see as he saw? His difficulty was a sentimental one, and one that she would not recognize. Archie was not logical. He had still not much feeling about having deceived Lord Balnillo, whose hospitality he had accepted and enjoyed, but, as he had said, he could not go man-hunting after James, who had offered him a brother's help, whose heart he had seen, whose life had already been cut in 2 by the baneful thing. There was little room in Archie's soul for anything but the shadow of that nightmare of treachery, and the shadow was creeping towards him. Had his mother been a grand duchess of spotless reputation, What could her virtue or her blue blood avail him in his present distress? She was nothing to him, that slut who had brought him forth. He owed her no allegiance, bore her no grudge. The living woman to whom he owed all stood before him, beloved, admired, cutting him to the heart. He assented silently, but Kristin understood that, though he looked as if she had carried her point, his looks were the only really unreliable part of him. She knew that he was that curious thing, a man who could keep his true self separate from his moods. It had taken her years to learn that, but she had learnt it at last. For once she was, like other people, baffled by his naturalness. It was plain that he suffered, yet she could not tell how she was to mould the hard stuff hidden below his suffering, but she must work with a heavy hand. "You will leave here tomorrow," she said. "You shall not stay here to shirk your duty." And again the pupils of her eyes contracted as she said it. "I will go now," said he. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Flemington. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nan Dodge. Flemington by Violet Jacob. Chapter 9. Toujours de l'audace. "Dog," said the beggar, addressing the yellow cur, "you and me'll need to be speirin' about this. Whiles it's no sae easy tellin' havers for truth." Though Skirling Wattie was on good terms with the whole of his team, the member of it whom he singled out for complete confidence, whom he regarded as an employer might regard the foreman of a working gang, was the yellow cur. The abuse he poured over the heads of his servants was meant more as incentive than as rebuke, and he fed them well, sharing his substance honestly with them, and looking to them for arduous service in return. They were a faithful, intelligent lot, good-tempered, but for one of the collies, and the accepted predominance of the yellow cur was merely one more illustration of the triumph of personality. His golden eyes, clear like unclouded amber, contrasted with the thick and vulgar yellow of his close coat, and the contrast was like that between spirit and flesh. He was a strong, untiring creature, with blunt jaws and legs that seemed to be made of steel, and it was characteristic of him that he seldom laid down but at night, and would stand turned in his traces, as though waiting for orders, looking towards his master as the latter sang or piped, whilst his comrades, extended in the dust, took advantage of the halt. The party was drawn up under the lee of a low wall by the grassy side of the Brecon road, and its grotesqueness seemed greater than ever because of its entirely unsuitable background. The wall encircled the site of an ancient building called Magdalen Chapel, which had long been ruined and now only survived in one detached fragment and in the half obliterated traces of its foundations. Round it the tangled grass rose, and a forest of withered hemlock that had nearly choked out the nettles stood up, traced like lacework against the line of hills beyond the basin. In summer its powdery white threw an evanescent grace over the spot. The place was a haunt of Skirling Watties, for it was a convenient half-way house between Montrose and Brecon, and the trees about it gave a comforting shelter from both sun and rain. The tailboard of the cart was turned to the wall so that the piper could lean his broad back against it, and there being not a dozen inches between the bottom of his cart and the ground, he was hidden from anyone who might chance to be in the chapel precincts. The projecting stone which made a stile for those who entered the enclosure was just level with his shoulder, and he had laid his pipes on it while he sat with folded arms and considered the situation. He had just been begging at a farm, and he had heard a rumour there that Archie Flemington was gone from Balnillo and had been seen in Brecon riding westwards on the preceding morning. The beggar had got a letter for him behind his sliding boards, which had to be delivered without delay. "Doag," said he again, "will awa' to old Davie's." Skirling Wattie distrusted rumour, for the inexactitudes of human observation and human tongues are better known to a man who lives by his wits than to anybody else. He was not going to accept this news without sifting it. To Balnillo he would go to find out whether the report was true. The only drawback was that "auld Davie," as he called the judge, abhorred and disapproved of beggars, and he did not know how he might stay in the place long enough to find out what he wanted. He was a privileged person at most houses, from the sea on the east to Forfar on the west, but Lord Balnillo would none of him. Nevertheless, he turned the wheels of his chariot in his direction. He wondered as he went along why he had not seen Archie by the way, but Archie had not left Balnillo by the Brechin road, being anxious to avoid him. What was the use of receiving instructions that he could not bring himself to carry out? The last person he wished to meet was the beggar. Wattie turned into the Balnillo gates and went up the avenue towards the stable. His pipes were silent, and the fallen leaves muffled the sound of his wheels. He knew about the mishap that had brought Flemington as a guest to the judge, and about the portrait he was painting, for tidings of all the happenings in the house reached the mill sooner or later. That source of gossip was invaluable to him. But though the miller had confirmed the report that Flemington had gone, he had been unable to tell him his exact destination. He drove into the stable yard and found it empty but for a man who was chopping wood. The latter paused between his strokes as he saw who had arrived. "I'm seeking his lordship," began Wattie, by way of discovering how the land lay. "Then ye'll no find him," replied the woodman, who was none other than the elder Andrew Robison, and who, like his master, disapproved consistently of the beggar. He was a sly old man, and he did not think it necessary to tell the intruder that the judge, though not in the house, was within hearing of the pipes. It was his boast that he had "left it to Providence," but he was not above an occasional shaping of events to suit himself. The beggar rolled up to the back door at the brisk pace he reserved for public occasions. A shriek of delight came from the kitchen window as the blast of his pipes buzzed and droned across the yard. The tune of the East Knock of Fife filled the place. A couple of maidservants came out and stood giggling as Wattie acknowledged their presence by a wag of the head that spoke gallantry, patronage, ribaldry, anything that a privileged old rogue can convey to young womanhood blooming near the soil. A groom came out of the stable and joined the group. The feet of the girls were tapping the ground. The beggar's expression grew more genially provocative, and his eyeballs rolled more recklessly as he blew and blew. His time was perfect. The groom, who was dancing, began to compose steps on his own account. Suddenly there was a whirl of petticoats, and he had seized one of the girls round the middle. They spun and counterspun, now loosing each other for the more serious business of each one's individual steps, now enlacing again, seeming flung together by some resistless elemental wind. The man's gaze, while he danced alone, was fixed on his own feet, as though he were chiding them, admiring them, directing them through niceties which only himself could appreciate. His partner's hair came down and fell in a loop of dull copper colour over her back. She was a finely made girl, and each curve of her body seemed to be surging against the agitated sheath of her clothes. The odd woman out circled round the pair like a fragment thrown off by the spin of some travelling meteor. The passion for dancing that is even now part of the life of Angus had caught all three, let loose upon them by the piper's handling of sound and rhythm. In the full tide of their intoxication, a door in the high wall of the yard opened, and Lord Balnillo came through it. The fragment broke from its erratic orbit and fled into the house with a scream. The meteor, a whirling twin star, rushed on, unseeing. The piper, who saw well enough, played strong and loud. Not the king himself could have stopped him in the middle of a strathspey. The yellow dog, on his feet among his reposing companions, showed a narrow white line between his lips, and the hackles rose upon his plebeian neck. "Silence!" cried Lord Balnillo, but the rest of his words were drowned by the yell of the pipes. As the dancers drew asunder again, they saw him and stopped. His wrath was centred on the beggar, and the man and maid slunk away unrebuked. Wattie finished his tune conscientiously. To Balnillo, impotent in the hurricane of braying reeds, each note that kept him dumb was a new insult, and he could see the knowledge of that fact in the piper's face. As the music ceased, the beggar swept off his bonnet, displaying his disreputable bald head, and bowed like the sovereign of some jovial and misgoverned kingdom. The yellow dog's attitude forbade Balnillo's nearer approach. "Go!" shouted the judge, pointing a shaking forefinger into space. "Out with you instantly! Is my house to be turned into a house of call for every thief and vagabond in Scotland? Have I not forbidden you my gates? Be gone from here immediately, or I will send for my men to cudgel you out." But he leapt back, for he had taken a step forward in his excitement, and the yellow cur's teeth were bare. "I'm seeking the painter, laddie," said the beggar, giving the dog a good-humoured cuff. "Away with you!" cried the other, unheeding. "You are a plague to the neighbourhood. I will have you put in Montrose jail. To-morrow, I promise you, you will find yourself where you cannot make gentlemen's houses into pandemoniums with your noise." "I'd like Brechin better," rejoined the beggar. "It's couther in there." Balnillo was a humane man, and he prided himself, as all the world knew, on some improvements he had suggested in the Montrose prison. He was speechless. "Ay," continued Wattie, "I'm thinking you've sent mony a better man than myself to the toll booth. But, dod, I'm no minding that. I'm asking you, where's the painter, lad?" One of Balnillo's fatal qualities was his power of turning, in mid-career of wrath or eloquence, to daily with side issues. He swallowed the fury rising to his lips. "What, Mr. Flemington?" he stammered. "What do you want of Mr. Flemington?" "Is yon what they ca' him? Well, I'm no seeking anything o' him, it's him that's seeking me." Astonishment put everything else out of Balnillo's mind. He glared at the intruder, his lips pursed, his fingers working. "He tell't me to come by to the muckle hoose and speir for him," said the other. "There was a sang he was needing. He was seeking to learn it, for he liked it fine, and he tell't to come away to the house and learn him. Dod, maybe he's forgotten. Callants like him's wilt swear to mind what they say, but old stocks like you and me's got mair sense." "I do not believe a word of it," protested Balnillo. "Hoots! You'll hae to try, or the puir lad'll no get his sang," exclaimed skirling Wattie, smiling broadly. "Just you cry on him to come down the stair, and we'll awa' ahint the back o' yon wa', and I'll learn him the music. It's this way." He unscrewed the chanter and blew a few piercing notes. The sound flew into the judge's face like the impact of a shower of pebbles. He clapped his hands to his ears. "I tell you, Mr. Flemington is not here," he bawled, raising his voice above the din. "He is gone. He is at Ardguys by this time." "Man, is yon true? Ye're no leein'?" exclaimed Wattie, dropping his weapon. "Is yon the way to speak his lordship?" said the deep voice of Andrew Robison, who had come up silently, his arms full of wood, behind the beggar's cart. "Turn this vagabond away!" exclaimed Balnillo, almost beside himself. "Send for the men. Bring a horsewhip from the stable. Impudent rogue! Go, Robison! Quick, man!" But Wattie's switch was in his hand, and the dogs were already turning before the elder had time to reach the stables. He had passed out under the clock and was disappearing between the trees of the avenue. He had learned what he wished to know, and the farther side of Brechin would be the best place for him for the next few days. He reflected that fortune had favoured him in keeping Captain Logie out of the way. There would have been no parleying with Captain Logie. End of chapter 9.